Before continuing to follow the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me the motivation to continue bringing you more engaging stories. And you, where are you listening to this story from? Please leave a comment to let me know. Stay with me to witness a story about quiet miracles, deep loss, and the power of human connection. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine, but from movement. Imagine this, a penthouse, pristine, untouched by life. It's quiet as a tomb. A silence that has settled over the place, like dust. And in that silence, Eric Gray sits in his office, running the empire he built from nothing, looking out at the world as if through a glass wall. Everything is perfect in a way except for one thing, Noe, his son. Noe is 9 years old, but his spirit, his soul, stopped at age 6, the moment the accident happened. The accident that took Lily, his mother, and left Noe paralyzed from the waist down. The boy hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years, not a word, not a sound. The doctors said he was beyond saving, that the injury had sealed him in a quiet, emotionless prison. They said Noe was gone. Eric didn't believe them, not fully, but every day that silence proved them right. He paid for the best care, the best therapy, poured his wealth into doctors and specialists and treatments that promised miracles. But nothing worked. He sat by Noe's side day after day, hoping for a sign, anything, right? But the boy just stared out of the window, his eyes blank. There was nothing left of Noe, nothing but the shell. But then, one quiet morning, everything changed. Eric had left for an early board meeting, like he always did. He had been gone for less than 2 hours when sudden cancellation opened up time he never took for himself. So he went home, not to see Noe, not to check on him, but out of habit, like always. There was always something to fix, something to attend to. The elevator ride was quick, the doors opened to the top floor, and he walked down the hallway, his mind already sorting through tasks for the day. That's when he heard it, music, not the usual sound of the penthouse's built-in speakers, but something different. It wasn't cold or sterile like everything else in his life. It was alive. It had a texture, a rhythm. Eric paused, unsure. Was it real? He walked slowly, his footsteps heavy against the marble floor. And then, as he turned the corner, he saw them, Rose, the cleaner. She was barefoot on the floor, her body moving, swaying in time to the music. And Noe was with her. His heart stopped. His son, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even blinked in years, was watching her, not staring blankly, not lost. No, was looking at Rose, tracking her every move. His eyes, those eyes that had once been empty, were now fixed on her with an intensity Eric hadn't seen in years. He was following her, no blinking, no hesitation, just pure focus. And Rose, she wasn't just cleaning. She was guiding him, leading him in a simple, graceful dance. The music was soft, gentle, and Rose moved with it as if she had known Noe all her life. She didn't push him, she didn't force him, she simply let him follow. And Noe was following. Eric stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he knew it was real. This wasn't some miracle. No, it was something else, something deeper. Noe hadn't just noticed Rose, he had responded. A flicker of life, like a fire that had been smothered for too long, suddenly ignited in the dark. It wasn't just the movement, it was the connection. Eric had spent millions trying to find a way to break through Noe's silence, through the barrier that separated them. He'd tried everything, every therapy, every machine, every program. But here was Rose, a woman who had no medical training, no degrees or certifications. Just a simple gesture, a dance, and Noe was looking at her, not through her, not around her. He was with her. The music slowed, and Rose turned, gently letting Noe's hand fall from hers. She didn't look at Eric. She didn't say anything. She just stepped back, collecting her cleaning supplies as if nothing had happened. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a show. It was just a moment. A moment that cracked open something Eric had been too afraid to touch. He stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move. His mind raced. Was this a violation? Was Rose breaking the rules? Should he be angry? Should he stop her? But the truth was, none of that mattered in the face of what he had seen. Noah wasn't just a patient anymore. He wasn't just a case. He was a boy, alive. And for the first time in years, he was present, not just in body, but in spirit. Eric didn't know what to feel. Anger, joy, confusion. He felt them all, but underneath it all was something new. A small seed of hope. When he finally walked over to Noe, he expected the boy to retreat into his usual shell. But Noe didn't pull away, he didn't speak. But there was a small shift, a subtle movement in his fingers, as if they remembered how to move. As if the music had unlocked something inside him, and then a sound, a hum, barely audible, but it was there. The faintest echo of the melody Rose had played. The next morning, Eric woke early, his mind still spinning. His body, stiff from the night spent, sitting in the dark, seemed to rebel against the weight of the new reality he found himself in. He had spent so long building walls around his grief, around his failures as a father. But now those walls were starting to crack. And the worst part was, he didn't know if he was ready for what might come tumbling down with them. Noah was still the same, sitting by the window, his face unmoving, eyes vacant, staring out at the skyline. But something was different in the air. The silence didn't feel like the same suffocating stillness that had defined their lives. It felt lighter, as if something had shifted, even if Noe had yet to acknowledge it. The small hum from the day before, the one that had torn through Eric's heart, was gone, but it hadn't been forgotten. He checked the tray outside Noe's room, another breakfast untouched. His eyes slid across the untouched dishes with a practiced detachment, the same ritual that had marked his every morning for years. He knew it was futile to expect any change, but he couldn't help but stand there for a moment longer than usual, as if waiting for something to happen. Waiting for Noe to move, to speak, to do anything. Rose arrived, as always, at precisely Ling a.m. She greeted him briefly, her face expressionless, and began moving about the house, carrying out her usual duties with the grace of someone who had long been invisible in the grand scheme of the Gray household. Eric hadn't spoken much to her in the past, beyond the occasional pleasantries. But now he found himself looking at her differently. The way she moved, the way she interacted with the space, with Noe, it was all so natural. There was no force in it, no attempt to make things happen. She simply existed, and in doing so, she brought something back into the world that Eric had thought was lost forever: connection. When Eric walked past the living room later that morning, he saw Rose humming softly to herself as she cleaned. She moved with a fluidity that was foreign to the mechanical efficiency he had come to expect from the staff. And there, in the corner of the room, Noe sat, his eyes following her every movement. There was no recognition in his gaze, not in the way one recognizes a friend or a stranger, but a subtle acknowledgement that he was aware. His head shifted slightly, his eyes tracking the sway of Rose's body, the smallest movement of his fingers. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't the kind of thing that would have sent doctors scrambling to take notes. But to Eric it was everything. Later that afternoon he called Rose into his office. He was certain that he needed to confront this. He had to know what had happened the day before. He had to know if this was something Rose was doing on purpose. Was it therapy? Was she trying to fix Noé? She had no credentials, no qualifications. What was she doing to his son? Rose entered the room with the same quiet composure that had marked her presence since she first stepped into the penthouse. She stood at the door, her hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes steady as if she knew what was coming. Eric didn't waste time. He looked at her, his eyes sharp. "Explain what you were doing," he demanded. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't angry, not yet. But he was confused, and confusion made him uneasy. Rose didn't flinch. She just stood there, meeting his gaze without fear, without hesitation. "I was dancing," she said simply. His jaw tightened. "With my son," he pressed, his voice edged with disbelief. "Yes," she said, her voice calm. Why?" He asked, the word nearly spat out. Rose took a deep breath, her eyes flickering for the briefest of moments. "Because I saw something in him, a flicker. I played a song, and his fingers twitched. He followed the rhythm. So I moved with him." Eric's heart stuttered. He couldn't understand what she was saying. His mind was still too clouded by years of therapy and medical jargon, by all the things the experts had told him. And now this woman, who had been nothing more than a cleaner, was telling him she had seen something in his son, something no one else had seen. She didn't sound arrogant, she didn't sound like a fool. She sounded like she believed it. And for a moment that was enough to make his insides twist. "You're not a therapist, Rose," Eric said, his voice tight, his mind racing. "You're not trained. You can't just touch my son." Rose didn't react, not in the way he expected. She didn't get defensive, she didn't back down. Instead, she simply looked at him, as though waiting for him to finish. When he did, she spoke again, her voice steady and firm. "No one else touches him either," she said quietly. Not with joy, not with trust. Eric's mind reeled. He opened his mouth to argue, but Rose continued, her words cutting through the noise in his head. "I didn't force him. He chose to move, Eric. He chose to force him. I didn't force him. I followed him. He chose to move, Eric. He chose to follow." She wasn't scolding him. She wasn't lecturing him. She was speaking the truth as she saw it. And it shook him deep in the bones, deeper than anything anyone had said to him in years. "I've paid for everything," Eric said, his voice almost breaking. "I've paid for the best care, for the best specialists. You think a dance is enough? You think music will fix him?" Rose didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer to him, her eyes calm, her voice soft. "No," she said, "it's not enough. But it's a beginning. You've spent so long trying to fix him, Eric, but maybe what he needs isn't fixing. Maybe he just needs someone who believes he's still in there." Eric's heart sank as her words settled in. She was right. He'd spent so long trying to make Noé whole again. He'd forgotten what it meant to simply be with him, to see him, to believe that he was still there in the depths of all that silence. "I crossed a line," Rose said quietly, her voice soft. "Maybe, but I would do it again." Eric stood there, his fists clenched, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't process. The silence between them stretched, heavy, thick, and in that moment he realized that it wasn't the line that mattered. It was the space she had opened up, the room she had made for Noé to move again, to breathe again. Not with science, not with rules, but with presence. Eric watched Rose leave the office, her calmness still lingering in the room like a soft shadow. He felt the weight of her words pressing against him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do with them. The notion of fixing Noé had always been his obsession, his way of dealing with the unbearable loss. And yet, what Rose had done, what she had shown him, was something he hadn't even considered. Maybe it wasn't about fixing. Maybe it was about feeling, just believing. He sat down behind his desk, trying to bring order back to his thoughts, trying to grasp at some thread of logic. But all he could think about was the way Noe had looked at Rose, how his eyes had followed her without hesitation, how he had been so still yet so present. Eric closed his eyes and tried to recapture that moment, the sound of the music, the flicker in his son's hand, the almost imperceptible movement. That was the most real thing he had seen in years, a dance, a song. Something so simple, yet it had cracked open the walls he had built around himself and Noe. He had spent so much of his life trying to perfect everything, the business, the therapy, the way things were supposed to work. But none of it had ever mattered as much as that moment, when Noe had moved. Eric's chest tightened at the thought. The sound of Noe's fingers twitching. The way the music had made him hum, not with his mouth, but with his very soul. It had been something that couldn't be measured, something that couldn't be fixed by any doctor, any prescription, any program. It was just life. That evening, as the staff left for the night, Eric stayed in the penthouse long after everyone else had gone. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't as suffocating. It wasn't as cold. There was a lingering warmth to it, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But even as hope whispered softly at the edges of his heart, the fear clawed back into his mind. What if it wasn't real? What if it was just a fluke? He knew better than to get too caught up in moments like these. They were fleeting. That's what he had been taught. And yet, there was a part of him, a part that had long been buried under grief and control, that wanted to believe. What if? He didn't sleep much that night. He sat in his study, watching the video footage from the morning over and over again, like he could catch something he had missed. The sound of Rose's voice, the melody, Noe's eyes tracking her. He couldn't shake the image. It haunted him. The next morning, when he arrived in the living room, he found it quieter than usual. Rose was already there, of course, moving through the space with the same quiet grace. Her mop swished against the floor, her humming barely audible, but it was there. Eric stood by the doorway, watching her from the shadows. He couldn't stop himself. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was hoping, somehow, to see it again. To see Noe, to see his son move, react. But when he looked over to the chair where Noe usually sat, his heart sank. The boy was still. Not even his fingers twitched. Eric felt his breath catch. For a moment it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He had been so sure, so certain, that something had changed. But now, Noe sat there, unmoving, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window. The small flame of hope that had lit inside Eric flickered and began to die out. Rose didn't acknowledge his presence at first. She continued with her cleaning, moving with purpose but without hurry. It was as though she was waiting for something, waiting for Noe, and maybe, just maybe, waiting for Eric too. Minutes passed. Eric watched Noe, his mind a storm of questions. What is this? Why is he not responding now? But Rose's soft humming brought him back, and then he noticed it, a shift. Noe's eyes twitched. It was so small, so subtle that Eric almost missed it, but there it was, a flicker, a spark. Noe's fingers curled ever so slightly, just enough for Eric to notice, and his heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was real after all. Maybe the flicker from the day before hadn't been a fluke. He wanted to reach out to his son, but something in his chest told him to wait, to be still. So he did. Rose, sensing the moment, didn't rush it. She simply continued her movements, sweeping the floor, humming the same soft tune. It wasn't forced. There was no urgency in her, just a quiet confidence that was both calming and maddening. It was as if she knew something Eric didn't, and then it happened. For the briefest of moments, Noah's head shifted, not to look at her, not directly, but towards the rhythm of her humming. His eyes followed the movement of the broom in her hands. His gaze was more focused now, sharper than it had been just moments before. For the first time in a long time, Eric saw the flicker of recognition in his son's eyes. The world slowed down. It was as if the universe had taken a breath, and in that moment, Eric saw it, the smallest, most fragile of connections. It was like seeing a seed sprout from the earth, unsure and fragile, but real. Noe was responding, and Eric couldn't believe it. Rose stopped her humming for a moment, just as she was about to move to the next task. She looked at Eric then, but not in the way he expected. She didn't smile. She didn't seek approval. She just looked at him, her eyes steady, and then continued with her work. But Eric wasn't watching Rose anymore. His eyes were on Noe. And this time, Noe's gaze was locked on him, not the vacant stare he had become so accustomed to. Not the vacant eyes of a boy lost in his own world. This was different. This was real. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't dramatic. But for the first time in years, Eric felt the floor beneath him shift. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a breakthrough that could be measured in data or charts. But it was a moment where his son was there, present in the world. Eric stood in the doorway, his feet rooted to the ground, his heart racing as he watched Noe. The boy's eyes locked onto his, not the way they used to, distant and clouded, but with something different now, something that Eric couldn't name but felt deep in his chest. His mind told him to approach, to say something, to make this moment something grand, something he could hold on to. But his body didn't move. Instead, he remained frozen, watching, as if this might all disappear the moment he broke the silence. No didn't move, not much, not yet. His hand, still resting on the arm of his wheelchair, was clenched now. The tension in his fingers was almost imperceptible, but Eric saw it. He watched as Noe's chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, as though the weight of the world was still pressing down on him. But Eric could feel it too, the faintest flicker, like a spark before the fire catches. Rose didn't look back. She kept humming, her movements as fluid as ever, her attention on the mundane task of cleaning. She hadn't stopped, hadn't acknowledged the shift. She didn't need to. Wammer, the truth was in the air between them now. The connection, the quiet understanding, wasn't something that needed to be spoken. It was something that was just there. Eric wanted to speak. He wanted to call Rose over, to ask her what had happened, how this could be real. But as the minutes ticked by, he found himself unwilling to break the fragile silence that had begun to settle around them. His questions would have to wait. The answers, for the first time, felt less important than the moment itself. Rose turned to him briefly, as if sensing his gaze. She didn't smile. There was no acknowledgment, no recognition of the shift that had taken place. She simply nodded once, as though confirming something that had always been true. Then she turned back to Noe, her voice softening as she hummed again. Eric felt the words twist in his chest, words he didn't know how to say. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to control outcomes. But now, as he watched his son move, he realized how little control he had over anything that truly mattered. There was no strategy here, no business plan, no projections, no calculations. There was only this, Noe, breathing, watching, living. For the first time in a long while, Eric allowed himself to feel the weight of that truth. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching Rose and Noe go, but when he finally turned to leave, he found his chest aching in a way that was unfamiliar. The walls he had spent years building around himself, around his grief, around his guilt, seemed to have crumbled just a little bit. Not enough to break him entirely, but enough to make him question everything. As he walked away, his footsteps heavy on the marble floors, he couldn't help but wonder what had Rose done. She had no medical training, no credentials. She was just the cleaner. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. She wasn't supposed to fix anything. And yet, here she was, creating something out of nothing. She had opened a door that Eric hadn't even known existed, and Noe had stepped through. He had expected to feel anger, resentment. He had expected to shut it all down, to put the pieces back into their neat little boxes. But instead, all he felt was something else, something softer, hope. He didn't want to name it. He didn't want to let it take root, not yet. But there it was, creeping into his chest, making itself comfortable, as if it had always belonged there. That night he sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept returning to the scene he had witnessed earlier, to the way Noe had followed Rose's movements with such intensity, to the smallest movements in Noe's fingers, the shift in his eyes. He couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the image of his son, so still, so empty for so long, suddenly alive again. But it wasn't just Noe, it was Rose too, the way she moved, the way she spoke. She had reached into that silence with something he hadn't been able to offer, something he hadn't even known was missing. It wasn't technique, it wasn't science, it was presence, it was trust. She wasn't trying to fix Noe. She wasn't trying to cure him. She was just there, in the moment, with him. And in that moment, Noe had responded. Eric's mind raced as he thought about the future. What now? What happens next? He had no answers. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to have them. All he could do was watch, and wait. Wait for Noe to move again. Wait for the next flicker, the next spark. The next morning, when Eric returned to the penthouse, he found himself drawn to the living room again. Noe was sitting by the window, as usual, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. Rose was cleaning, her humming barely audible as she moved through the room. But this time, Eric didn't wait for something to happen. He walked toward Noe slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. Noe didn't react at first. He didn't look at Eric. He didn't speak. But then, as Eric reached out to touch his shoulder, he felt something shift. It was the smallest of movements, but it was there. Noe's head turned slightly, just enough to meet his father's gaze. And for the first time in years, Eric saw something in his son's eyes. Not the blankness, not the vacancy, but recognition. It wasn't a smile, it wasn't a word, but it was enough. Enough to shatter the silence, enough to break through the walls that had kept them apart for so long. And in that moment, Eric realized that he didn't need to fix Noe. He didn't need to make him speak, or walk, or do anything. He just needed to be there. Just like Rose had been, he didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if Noe would speak, if he would ever walk again, if he would ever truly be whole. But for the first time, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Noe had moved, that he had responded, that there was still life, still hope. And in that moment, as he stood beside his son, Eric felt something shift inside himself. Not just for Noe, but for him. The man who had spent so long chasing after things, money, success, control, was beginning to understand that none of it mattered in the face of real, true connection. Hope was fragile, but it was there. Days passed, and Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring within the penthouse, something that had been dormant for so long. The house, once so silent and cold, now seemed to hum with a quiet energy. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was there, a presence, an undercurrent that Eric couldn't ignore. Rose had become a part of that. Not just as a cleaner, not just as a worker in the background, but as something more. She had somehow found a way to connect with Noe in a way no one else had been able to, and the effects were subtle but Rose didn't change her routine. She still cleaned the house, still moved with that quiet grace that had first drawn Eric's attention. She still hummed soft and steady as she worked, but now there was a new dynamic. No, who had once been so still, so removed from the world around him, was starting to show small signs of change. His eyes followed Rose more closely. His head tilted slightly when she passed by. His hands, always so rigid, now occasionally twitched or curled slightly. It wasn't much. It wasn't a breakthrough. But it was progress, of a kind Eric noticed it, even though he didn't want to. He tried to convince himself that it was just coincidence, just a fluke. But he couldn't ignore the fact that his son, who had been locked away in silence for so long, was showing signs of life. Signs that no doctor, no therapist, no program had been able to produce. And it wasn't Rose's training, her expertise, or her methods that had caused this. It was her presence, her patience, her trust. She hadn't come to fix Noe. She hadn't come to force him to move, to speak, to engage. She had just been there. And somehow that had been enough. Eric's mind swirled with confusion. Part of him wanted to call the doctors, the specialists, to ask them what this meant. He wanted to understand it. He needed to understand it. But another part of him, the part that had been so focused on fixing, on solving problems, knew deep down that there was no explanation for this. It wasn't something that could be explained. It wasn't something that could be quantified or measured. It was just happening. And for the first time in years, Eric wasn't sure if he wanted to know why. He found himself watching Rose more often, though he tried to hide it. He watched her when she cleaned, when she hummed, when she moved through the rooms. He watched her with Noe, seeing the way she was able to connect with him without saying a word. And he realized something that unsettled him. Surround Rose wasn't just reaching Noe. She was reaching him too. Her quiet presence, her calm patience, was slowly breaking down the walls he had spent so many years building. The walls of grief, the walls of control, the walls that had kept him locked in a world where everything had to be fixed, where nothing was allowed to just... One afternoon, when Rose was cleaning the hallway near Noah's room, Eric found himself standing at the threshold of the doorway, watching her. Noah was sitting by the window, as usual, but this time, his hand was resting on the arm of his wheelchair. His fingers were twitching, barely noticeable, but there, Rose moved slowly, gracefully, as she hummed. She didn't look at Eric, didn't acknowledge him at all. She didn't need to. She was present, and that was enough. And for the first time in a long while, Eric allowed himself to just be there too, without expectation. He stood silently, watching his son, and for a moment, he felt a quiet peace that he hadn't known in years. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a turning point. The tension in his chest loosened just a little. He wasn't fighting it anymore. He wasn't trying to control it. He was just there. And that was enough. Over the next few days, Eric found himself becoming more attuned to the subtle shifts in Noe. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. His fingers moved more often now, curling and uncurling in a way that suggested awareness. His gaze followed people as they moved through the room, and there was a slight shift in his posture when Rose approached, as if he was aware of her presence, responding to it in a way he hadn't before. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't a breakthrough, but it was progress. Eric didn't say anything to Rose about it. He didn't know how to. What could he say? Thank you, I've seen what you've done? The words didn't feel right. He wasn't ready to confront the reality of what was happening. He wasn't ready to acknowledge that he might have been wrong all this time. That maybe he had been going about it all wrong, chasing after solutions and answers, when the answer had always been something simpler, something more human: presence. One evening, as Rose was preparing to leave for the night, Eric found himself walking toward her. He didn't know why. He hadn't planned to speak to her, hadn't planned to do anything, but something in him urged him to move, to break the silence between them. "Rose," he said, his voice low. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady. She didn't say anything at first, just waited for him to speak. "Thank you," he said quietly, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her eyes. But she didn't react. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just accepted the words, as if she had been expecting them all along. She stepped closer to him, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "He's your son, Eric," she said softly. "He's always been there." And then she turned and walked away, leaving Eric standing there, his chest tight with emotion, feeling a little more human than he had in years. The truth of her words settled in him, and he couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude. For the first time, he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was simply watching. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The days passed, and the penthouse grew quieter in a way that wasn't oppressive, but rather soothing. Rose's presence had become a fixture in the house, not as an employee or even as a caretaker, but as something deeper, something necessary. She didn't try to change anything. She didn't try to force Noe to speak, to move, to be anything other than what he was. She simply existed in the same space as him, and somehow that made all the difference. Eric watched her with Noe more often now. He couldn't stop himself. He found that he was always looking for the smallest sign, the faintest change in Noe's behavior. Sometimes it was a twitch in his fingers. Sometimes it was the way his eyes lingered on Rose, as if he were trying to hold on to the connection between them. And then one day, as he stood in the doorway of Noe's room watching them, he saw something new. Rose was humming, as usual, a soft melodic tune that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Noe's head was turned toward her, his eyes following the rhythm of her movements. His hand was resting on the arm of his wheelchair, and for the first time in months, it wasn't stiff or frozen. It was relaxed. His fingers were slightly curled, and Eric saw it, the smallest of movements, a subtle twitch as though he was responding to the melody, not forcing it, not trying to make it happen, but simply being. And in that moment, Eric realized that this wasn't just about Noe, it was about him too. He had been so focused on fixing everything, so focused on doing whatever it took to bring his son back to life, to make him whole again. But what he had never realized, what he had never allowed himself to understand, was that healing didn't come from fixing. It didn't come from controlling. Healing came from presence. From being there, in the moment, and allowing something to unfold naturally. Rose had understood this from the very beginning. She didn't have the answers, but she had something more important: patience, trust. And in her quiet way, she had given Noe the space to begin healing on his own. Eric leaned against the doorframe, watching them in silence. He didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to break the fragile peace that had settled between them. Rose didn't rush Noe. She didn't push him. She simply moved in a rhythm, gentle and steady, as if she were guiding him through something that only they could understand. The music, the movement, the connection, it wasn't about progress or success. It was about being, and that was enough. Later that evening, after the staff had left and the penthouse had settled into its usual quiet, Eric found himself standing by the window in his office, looking out at the city below. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something profound. His son was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but he was changing. It wasn't the dramatic breakthrough that Eric had been hoping for, the moment when Noe would speak or walk again. But it was something just as powerful. Noe was present. He was alive in ways that Eric hadn't thought possible, and Rose, she was still there. Quiet, unobtrusive, but always present, she had become a part of this family in a way that no one else had. Eric couldn't explain it, and he didn't know if he could ever thank her enough for what she had done. But somehow she had done the impossible. She had brought Noe back to life, not by fixing him, but by seeing him, by being there for him, in a way that no one else had been able to. That night, after dinner, Eric found himself alone in the living room. Rose had left for the day, but the memory of the way Noe had responded to her lingered in the air. He sat in the same chair where he had watched the two of them earlier, his fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest. He had expected to feel angry, to feel a need to take control of the situation. But instead he felt a strange sense of peace, a peace that had eluded him for so long. The next morning as he walked through the penthouse, he found Noe sitting by the window again. The boy hadn't moved much, but there was something different in his posture, something open. Eric stood there for a long time, just watching, trying to figure out what to do next. He didn't want to rush things. He didn't want to force Noe to move faster than he was ready. But there was one thing he knew for certain now. Noe was ready. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be the same as the one they had been traveling. Rose entered the room quietly, as always, carrying her cleaning supplies. She didn't look at Eric right away, but there was a quiet understanding between them. She didn't need to ask him how he was feeling. She didn't need to explain anything. She just went about her work, humming softly, creating the space for Noe to be. And in that space, something began to stir. Eric watched her as she moved through the room, the same gentle rhythm that had captivated him from the start. She was so different from everyone else. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to force anything. She simply was, and that was all Noe needed, and that, Eric realized, was all he needed too. The door to the penthouse opened, and Casey entered, carrying a tray of tea. She paused when she saw Eric standing there, his eyes fixed on Rose and Noe. There was something unspoken between them, something Casey didn't fully understand, but she saw it. She saw the change, the shift that had taken place in the house. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with something new, something alive. Eric didn't speak for a while. He didn't need to. He just stood there, watching Noe, watching Rose, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was something. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Eric allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had started, and that was enough. As the days passed, the penthouse took on a new rhythm, a quiet cadence that Eric hadn't expected. It was as if everything, from the way the sunlight crept through the windows in the mornings to the soft hum of the housekeeper's cleaning routines, had found a new pace. And Noe, though still mostly silent, seemed to feel it too. His presence in the house wasn't a stillness now. It was a kind of waiting, a waiting that didn't feel like resignation, but like anticipation. Something was on the verge of happening, something Eric couldn't quite name. Rose's role in all of this had not changed. She continued to hum as she worked, moved gracefully through the house, never pushing, never rushing. She was just there, present, and somehow that was enough for Noe. He wasn't rushing forward, wasn't suddenly transformed, but his movements were more deliberate now. His eyes tracked people more steadily, his fingers twitched more often. He no longer looked through people, he looked at them. At her, Eric found himself watching more often. Not Rose. Not No, but himself. The shift in the house, the shift in Noe, had begun to reflect in him as well. He'd caught himself standing by the door, watching his son look at someone else. And for a moment, it was almost as though he didn't recognize the man standing in his own house. The man who had built walls around everything, around his son, around his grief, around his business. That man was still there, but now he felt less sure of himself. The certainty he had once held in his ability to control every little thing was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet. It was disarming, it was terrifying, but it was also freeing. There were no answers, no quick fixes, just moments. And for the first time in years, Eric realized he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to chase after success or perfection. He just needed to be there with Noe, with Rose, with whatever came next. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the penthouse in soft shades of amber and gold, Eric found himself sitting in the living room, staring at Noe. The boy was staring out of the window, as he often did, but this time something felt different. There was a presence in the room that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the cold, sterile quiet of the past. It was warmer, fuller, more alive. Rose was cleaning near the window, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were not only cleaning the space, but the energy within it. Eric hadn't noticed it before, but now he did. Rose wasn't just cleaning. She was clearing the way for something to happen. Something neither she nor he could control, but something that was happening regardless. She didn't need to understand it. She didn't need to explain it. She just moved through the space with intention, allowing everything to unfold at its own pace. No's head shifted slightly, his eyes still fixed on the world outside, but his posture had changed. It wasn't much, just the faintest adjustment of his back, a subtle shift in the way he sat in his wheelchair. But it was enough. Eric noticed it. He saw it, the smallest change. The beginning of something that was still far away but drawing closer with every passing day. Rose, Eric said softly, breaking the quiet between them. She turned to face him, a slight tilt of her head, acknowledging his presence. She didn't speak at first, but she didn't need to. Her gaze was steady, calm, as if she knew what he wanted to say without him needing to say it. I'm not sure what's happening," Eric admitted, his voice lower than he meant it to be. There was a rawness to his words, an uncertainty that had always been buried beneath layers of control and detachment. "But I think I'm starting to understand." Rose nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips, though it wasn't a smile of triumph. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the kind of smile that came from a quiet knowing, the understanding that something had shifted, but that the journey was far from over. She walked over to him slowly, her hands gently folded in front of her. She didn't sit, didn't make any gesture, she just stood there, waiting as if giving him space. Eric looked at Noe, his eyes softening as he took in his son's stillness. It wasn't empty. It wasn't the silence of a boy locked away in a world of his own. It was a silence full of possibility, full of something he couldn't quite grasp yet, but that he could feel. Deep down he knew it was there, and for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly. "I don't know if Noe will ever speak again, or walk again, but whatever happens, I want to be here. I want to be with him. I want to stop trying to fix him." Rose didn't say anything in reply. She didn't need to. Her presence was all the answer Eric needed. It was enough. She simply walked over to the table, collecting her cleaning supplies. She hummed quietly, and Noe's eyes followed the rhythm, just the faintest shift in his gaze, as if he were aware of her movements without needing to see her. Without needing to be told what to do, he was simply there. As Rose worked, Eric continued to watch. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he couldn't stop himself from watching. And then, without thinking, he found himself walking toward Noe. Slowly, cautiously, unsure of how to bridge the distance that still seemed to stretch between them. But Noe didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. His eyes turned to meet his father's, and for the first time in years, Eric didn't feel the weight of that silence. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It was just there, waiting, watching. "I'm here, son," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were fragile. "And I'm not going anywhere." Noe didn't respond, but his eyes remained on his father, steady, not blank, not empty. Just there. Rose glanced over at Eric, her gaze soft. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain. She simply continued with her work, humming the same quiet tune. And Eric, for the first time in years, simply sat and watched. The days blurred together in a way that felt new. There was no longer the rigid separation between tasks, between work, between the duties that Eric once performed with such precise focus. Now everything felt softer, like the edges of a world he had once understood clearly had begun to soften and bend. He no longer walked the halls of his penthouse as if he were inspecting a machine, a piece of carefully crafted if. Instead, he moved through the space with a quiet reverence, as if waiting for something unspoken to unfold, to reach its own rhythm, just as Noah was slowly doing. The tension in Eric's shoulders, the kind he hadn't noticed before, had begun to loosen. It wasn't gone, not entirely. It never would be, not with all the years of habit, of control, of fear, but it was different. He had become more patient, more present. The need to fix things, to rush toward solutions, had ebbed. There was a peace now, one that hovered in the background, soft and unassuming, but it was there, steady. No, too, seemed to feel it. Though still mostly silent, there was something about him now, something that had shifted. He wasn't as withdrawn, as distant. The way he held himself, his posture was subtly more open. His eyes still followed Rose when she passed, but now he seemed to anticipate her movements, as though he were aware of the rhythm of her presence, of the way she hummed without urgency. And Eric saw it. His son was learning how to be. He was existing again, not as a patient to be fixed, but as a boy, a person. Rose continued to guide him through each day, not through force, but through invitation. There were no grand breakthroughs, no announcements of progress. It was all done quietly, in the space between actions, in the way Noah would occasionally blink twice when asked a question, or the way his hand would twitch when she moved a certain way. These were small things, unnoticeable to anyone else, but to Eric they were everything. Each small movement, each flicker of attention from Noah was a gift, a tiny revolution unfolding before his eyes. One morning, Rose arrived earlier than usual, and the penthouse felt particularly still, almost suspended in time. Eric had spent the night in his office, thinking, reflecting on everything that had happened. He was no longer sure when he had last truly rested, but something in him was lighter now. It was as though the air around him had cleared, and his mind, once consumed by worry and constant calculation, had begun to settle. He heard Rose's voice as she hummed her familiar tune through the hallway. He didn't get up to check on her. He didn't need to. She wasn't cleaning, not really. She was guiding in her own quiet, steady way. Eric knew that Noe would be watching her. He would be tracking her every movement, anticipating the next step, the next breath in their unspoken dance. And that somehow was enough for him. It was enough to simply watch, to be there without expectation. Later, Eric found himself in the living room, just out of view of Noe's usual spot by the window. He stood there, unsure of what to do, his hands at his sides, his mind swirling with all the questions that had no answers. He wasn't sure if Noe would speak today or the next day. He wasn't sure when or if his son would fully come back to him. But somehow that uncertainty didn't weigh on him the way it used to. The unknown wasn't as frightening anymore. Rose appeared in the doorway, as quiet and unobtrusive as always. Her hands were still folded in front of her, the faintest of smiles on her lips. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. She simply looked at him, her gaze calm and steady. She was still waiting just like him. Eric's throat tightened as he met her eyes. She didn't need to speak. She knew what he needed, just as he was beginning to understand what he needed, too. For the first time, he allowed himself to exhale. There was no need to push, no need to demand answers. The moments he had been so desperate to fix, to control, were unfolding before him, not with dramatic force, but with gentle persistence, like the slow rhythm of the music that always played softly in the background, the rhythm that Rose had created with Noe, with herself. Rose turned back toward Noe, who was sitting near the window, his hands resting on his lap. There, for a long while, she simply moved about the room, tidying up without rushing. She didn't speak, but Eric could see how Noe's eyes followed her movements, how his fingers curled slightly in response to the rhythm of her presence. It was a slow progression, a quiet progression. No didn't blink twice when asked a question, but he did track Rose's movements more attentively now. His head tilted as she moved past him, and his fingers, once stiff, relaxed again. Rose didn't stop what she was doing. She didn't look for any sort of approval. She didn't wait for Noe to perform. She was simply there, in the space, allowing him to move at his own pace. Eric watched all of this, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing Noe, he was seeing himself. Not through the lens of what had been broken or lost, but through what had always been there, underneath it all. He wasn't a man trying to fix his son. He was just a father. A father standing in the presence of his son, not asking anything of him, not forcing anything, just allowing space to be. And then, for the first time since that moment when Noe had followed Rose's hand, the boy did something new. He shifted in his wheelchair, and Eric saw his hand twitch the slightest movement. His fingers curled slightly, and the smallest flicker of a smile danced at the corners of his lips. It was barely there, not enough for anyone to notice, but Eric saw it. And in that moment he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't a race. This wasn't about fixing Noe. This wasn't about creating an end goal or reaching some milestone. This was about presence, about being with each other, about allowing Noe to be, without pressure, without expectation. Eric blinked away a tear, though he didn't want to. He was afraid of what it meant. Afraid that he wasn't ready for it. But he knew deep down that he had been waiting for this for a long time, waiting for the day when he could simply be with his son, not as a doctor, not as a therapist, not as a businessman trying to control everything, but as a father sitting next to his son, watching him move, slowly, carefully, but steadily. The days that followed felt like a slow, unfolding story. Not a dramatic saga filled with grand gestures or earth-shattering breakthroughs, but something subtler. Each moment, each small movement carried a weight of its own. And in the quiet spaces between them, Eric found himself letting go of the need for answers. constant chase for progress. He had spent so long searching for a solution, for a cure, for something to fix, that he had forgotten what it meant to just. The penthouse, which once echoed with the noise of ambition and efficiency, had taken on a new kind of life. It wasn't bustling with activity, not in the way it had when Eric was climbing his empire, always pushing forward, demanding more. Now it felt like a place of stillness, not the cold, lifeless stillness that had haunted it for so long, but a stillness that was pregnant with potential, a stillness that allowed room for things to grow, quietly, at their own pace. No, still so quiet, still so reserved, had changed in ways that weren't always visible, but were undeniable. His eyes followed people not with that vacant stare, but with a soft intensity. His fingers twitched occasionally, though not enough to be noticed by anyone else. But to Eric, it was everything. Each small sign was a victory. Every movement was proof that something was still alive inside Noe, something that had never truly left, even when the world had abandoned him. Rose continued her quiet dance through the house. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't expecting anything. She didn't try to make things happen. She simply showed up. Every day she came and she did the work. But it wasn't just cleaning. It was something more. She had become a part of the fabric of the house, a part of Noe's healing, and in a way, a part of Eric's too. She had opened a door that Eric hadn't even known he had locked. It wasn't just Noe who needed healing, it was him. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but it had. Eric had stopped holding his breath, waiting for Noe to speak, to walk, to do something that would make it all feel real. He had stopped expecting, stopped demanding. It wasn't about waiting for a specific moment anymore. It was about presence, about being with Noe right where he was, right where they both were. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Eric found himself standing in the hallway, looking out the large windows of the living room. The city stretched below him, bathed in the soft, fading light of dusk. His mind wandered back to the night before the accident, the night when he and Lily had danced in the living room just before Noe had taken his first steps. Eric had been so young then, so hopeful, so full of dreams. But all of that had changed in an instant, and yet here he was, not in the past, not chasing a dream, but right here, right now, with Rose. He didn't need to go back. He didn't need to fix anything, he just needed to be. The sound of movement caught his attention. Rose was in the living room, humming softly, as always. She was walking back and forth, carrying out her tasks with the same steady rhythm. Noe was sitting near the window, his eyes tracking her movements. It was subtle, but it was there. His gaze shifted slightly, his head tilting ever so slightly to follow her. Eric felt something stir inside him. It wasn't a burst of hope, it wasn't a breakthrough. It was just a quiet recognition that something had changed. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just Noe, it was him too. He stepped into the room slowly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. Rose looked up when he entered, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging his presence, and continued her humming. Eric sat in the armchair by the window, watching Noe, watching Rose. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The moment stretched on. Noe's eyes followed Rose as she moved around the room. His hand twitched, then relaxed. His fingers curled slightly, just enough for Eric to notice. He was present. He wasn't just existing. He was here, in the world. Rose's humming slowed as she finished her work, and she moved to stand by the door. She didn't look at Eric, but she didn't need to. She simply nodded once, as if to say, "It's happening." As she left the room, Eric didn't move. He stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on Noe. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. For the first time, Eric felt no need to fill the silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't oppressive. It was full of presence, full of a connection he had long since given up on. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he finally stood to leave, it was with a sense of calm that had eluded him for so long. He walked past Noe, whose eyes followed him as he passed, but Eric didn't rush. He didn't feel the need to hurry. The moment had unfolded in its own time, and he had been there for it. That was enough. That night, as he lay in bed, his mind drifted again to the past, to Lily, to the accident, to everything he had lost. But this time he didn't feel the weight of it the same way. The grief was still there, still present, but it didn't suffocate him. It was no longer the only thing that defined him. He had begun to let go of the need to fix everything, to control everything. And in doing so, he had begun to heal. The next morning, as the sun crept through the blinds and painted the room in soft light, Eric found himself standing by the window again, at Strs. Eric found himself standing by the window again, looking out at the city. But this time it was different. He wasn't looking at it as if it were a business to be conquered. He was simply looking, and for the first time, he was okay with that. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to push. He just needed to be. The mornings had a quiet rhythm now, a steadiness that was both familiar and new. Eric found himself waking with the sunrise, not with a mind full of business deals and deadlines, but with a more deliberate, slower pace. He didn't rush to make decisions. He didn't force himself into the constant pursuit of control. The penthouse had transformed, but so had he, bit by bit, in ways that were impossible to explain and yet undeniable. Rose continued her days in the same quiet way. She arrived each morning with her cleaning supplies, but it wasn't just cleaning she did. It was as if she were moving through a space she had learned to read, learning the contours of the walls and the spaces between them, knowing exactly how to fill them. She didn't speak much. She didn't try to fill the silence with words or promises of change. She just let things unfold. It wasn't what Eric had expected. In fact, it wasn't even what he had wanted at first. He had been desperate for answers, for breakthroughs, for some magic formula that would fix Noe, that would fix him. But now he could see it clearly. It wasn't about fixing, it was about being. No, too, had changed in ways that were so small, so subtle, they could have been missed by anyone else. But Eric saw it. Every day his son grew a little more present, a little more here. His fingers moved more often. His eyes followed the rhythm of people's movements. His body, though still mostly still, had begun to hold itself with more purpose. It wasn't walking, it wasn't speaking, but it was something. It was connection. On one particular morning, Eric found himself standing by the window, looking out at the city. The usual rush of thoughts and plans didn't cloud his mind today. He simply stood there, breathing in the cool morning air, letting the quiet of the house settle around him. He heard Rose humming in the distance, heard the sound of her soft footsteps as she moved through the rooms. And for the first time he felt the weight of his own presence. It wasn't a burden. It wasn't something to be carried. It was simply there, like the hum of the house, steady and present. No sat in his wheelchair by the window, just as he always did. But today something was different. Eric could feel it before he even looked at his son. It wasn't a breakthrough, not a dramatic change. But Noe's eyes were no longer unfocused, drifting somewhere in the distance. His gaze was sharp, directed. He was looking out at the world, but he wasn't lost in it. He was aware. For the first time, Noe seemed to be holding the space around him, not just existing in it. And it wasn't because of anything Eric or Rose had done. It was because Noe had chosen, in his own time, to take part in the world again, to be present. Eric slowly walked toward Noe, his heart beating faster with each step, but not out of fear. It wasn't fear anymore, it was something softer, something he didn't fully understand. He stood next to his son, not knowing what to say, but knowing that words weren't necessary. For once, he didn't need to make this moment meaningful. It already was. No didn't look up at him immediately. He simply stared out the window, his fingers resting on the arm of his wheelchair. But then, slowly, his head shifted, and his eyes met Eric's. It wasn't the same vacant look Eric had seen so many times before. It was a look of recognition, of presence. "Hey, buddy," Eric whispered, his voice soft, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. No didn't answer. He didn't need to. But Eric saw it in the way Noe held his gaze. In the subtle way his lips parted just the slightest bit, as if he were considering speaking, as if he were holding something inside him, not ready to release it just yet. It was enough. It was more than enough. As Eric stood there, watching Noe, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent so many years pushing, controlling, fixing. But here, in this moment, in this stillness, he realized that everything he had been searching for wasn't outside of him. It wasn't in the success or the money or the business deals. It wasn't even in Noe's recovery. It was here, in the quiet, in the presence, in the connection that didn't need to be forced. It was Rose who had shown him that. Without speaking a word, without forcing anything, she had brought presence into their lives. She had taught them that healing wasn't about making things go faster, about pushing for progress. It was about allowing space for what was already there to come forward, gently, at its own pace. Rose entered the room, her movements as fluid as ever. She didn't stop when she saw them. She didn't speak. She simply moved to the corner of the room, humming softly as she wiped down the surfaces, moving with the same rhythm that had become so familiar to Eric. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't trying to create anything. She was simply present, and that presence was enough. Noe's eyes shifted again, just the faintest tilt of his head. He followed Rose with his gaze, and for the first time Eric saw him engage in the world around him. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an active participant, and that was everything. Eric felt a weight lift from his chest, a release he hadn't known he was holding on to. There were still so many unknowns. There were still so many questions about what would come next for Noe, for him, for the family. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were all together, in this space, present, and for the first time in years, that was enough. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching Noe, watching Rose. But it didn't matter. The minutes passed like hours, and yet it felt like no time had passed at all. There was no urgency, no pressure, just being, and for the first time, Eric allowed himself to simply be. The days that followed were filled with small, gentle revelations. There was a softness to the penthouse now, a warmth that had never existed before. The silence that had once hung so heavily in the air, suffocating and empty, had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that couldn't be measured, something beyond words. Eric hadn't realized it at first, but now he felt it in every corner of the house. He felt it in the way he moved, in the way he interacted with Noe, in the way he watched Rose work. There was something unspoken between them, a kind of understanding that had changed the air in the penthouse. It was subtle, it wasn't loud, but it was real. No, still mostly silent, was becoming more aware. Eric realized he wasn't just watching the world passively anymore. He wasn't just a passive observer in his own life. He was reacting, he was engaging. It was small, tiny movements. A shift of the head here, a flicker of his fingers there. But to Eric, it was everything. The doctors had told him that Noe was locked in, that there was no hope of recovery, that the boy he once knew was gone. But now, as he watched Noe's eyes follow Rose, his fingers twitch ever so slightly in response to her. Humming, Eric knew the doctors had been wrong. Noe was there. He had always been there. He had just needed the right moment to come back to life. And it wasn't just Noe, it was Eric too. Rose's quiet presence, her unwavering patience, had taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. Too, she had shown him how to be still, how to simply be. It wasn't about fixing, about finding a solution, about making things better. It was about presence. It was about showing up, and that, more than anything, was what had made the difference for Noe. Eric had spent so many years running, chasing after success, after answers. He had buried himself in work, in tasks, in the illusion that control meant safety. But now, standing in the quiet of the penthouse, watching Rose move through the house with ease, watching Noe engage with the world around him in ways that were still small but powerful, Eric realized that he had been looking for the wrong thing all along. He didn't need to fix Noe. He didn't need to find the perfect solution. He just needed to be there, and that was enough. One evening, as Rose was humming in the background, moving from one room to the next kyo, Eric sat by Noe, as he often did now, in silence. It was a comfortable silence, not one filled with the heavy weight of things left unsaid, but one that was full of... The silence wasn't empty. It was alive, and for the first time in years, Eric wasn't trying to fill it. He wasn't trying to make it go away. He was simply present in it. Rose stopped humming for a moment and turned to face him. Her eyes were calm, steady, as if she had known all along what Eric needed to realize. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to say anything. He didn't need to explain himself, didn't need to justify his actions or his emotions. He simply was. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a simple thank you. It was the kind of thank you that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere raw. He had been holding on to so many things for so long, and now, with those words, he was letting them go. He wasn't just thanking Rose for what she had done for Noe, for the small, quiet ways she had helped him find his way back into the world. He was thanking her for showing him what it meant to let go. Rose didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, her face softening. She had always known, she had always been there. Not to fix anything, not to solve the problem, but to simply be present. And in that, she had given them both something more valuable than any solution. She had given them the space to feel, to connect, to simply be together. Eric sat in silence for a long while after that, watching Noe, watching the way his son's eyes moved, the way his fingers twitched, the way he responded to the presence around him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't earth-shattering, but it was everything. It was Noe, living. The next morning, Eric found himself standing by the window again, as he had so many times before. But this time, he didn't feel the same rush of thoughts clouding his mind. He didn't feel the need to rush, to plan, to do anything. He was simply there. The sun was rising over the city, the light spilling through the windows, and for the first time, Eric felt like he could breathe. He wasn't holding on to anything anymore. He wasn't trying to fix anything anymore. He was just here. Noe was sitting by the window again, his fingers resting on the arm of his wheelchair. But today, Eric noticed something new. The boy's head was turned slightly, his gaze focused on something beyond the window. He wasn't staring blankly. He wasn't lost, he was looking. Eric didn't say anything. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there watching. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to do anything. The world was unfolding around him, and he was simply a part of it. And for once, that was enough. The mornings, now, had a new rhythm, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath and was beginning to exhale. Eric woke each day not to the frantic bustle of meetings, to-do lists, or the constant drive to fix something. No, he woke with a quietness in his chest that hadn't been there before. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close, something tentative, like a fragile flower pushing its way through the soil, knowing the dangers of the world, but still reaching toward the light. No, he still sat by the window, but his posture had changed. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't rise from his wheelchair or turn around to speak, but it was different. There was an awareness in his stillness. His hands rested on the arm of the chair, fingers relaxed, not clenched in the tight, unyielding grip they had once had. There was no obvious breakthrough, no dramatic moment of he's back. But there was something in the air, a kind of anticipation, as though Noe had already made his peace with the world in his own quiet way. He wasn't fixed, no, not yet, but he was there, and that was everything. Eric noticed the smallest changes, how Noe's gaze would follow Rose's movements more closely, how his fingers, once stiff, would sometimes twitch or move with the gentleness of someone who was remembering what it was like to touch and to feel. It wasn't progress in the way a doctor would measure it. It was progress in the only way that mattered. He was present. Rose continued her work, humming her familiar tune as she cleaned. Her voice was soft, low, like a river flowing gently, not forcing its way through the earth, but moving, shaping, creating a new path. She had never tried to fix Noe. She had never imposed a timetable or tried to create a miraculous moment. Instead, she just showed up, and in her quiet, steady way, she became part of the healing process. Not through skill or technique, but through presence. Eric found himself drawn to her, not in the way he had expected. It wasn't the same attraction he had felt before, the fascination with someone who could do what he couldn't. It was something else entirely, a quiet respect, a gratitude that had taken root slowly, without him even realizing it. He couldn't have said when it had happened, but now he saw her for what she truly was. Not just a cleaner, not just a presence in the house. She was a teacher, not with words, but with action. She had taught him to be still. She had taught him to simply be there, without needing to control or fix. She had opened up the possibility of what it meant to live with something broken. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Eric found himself standing by the window, staring out at the skyline, lost in his thoughts. He didn't feel the same weight of despair that had followed him around for so long. He didn't feel the crushing guilt that he should have done more, that he should have fixed it all. No, now he felt a strange lightness, a quiet acceptance that he had never known before. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Lily, to the life they had once imagined for themselves, to the way they had danced in the living room that night, just before the accident. That night when everything seemed perfect. He could still remember her laugh, the way she had held Noe in her arms, the way they had spun around the room, as if they had all the time in the world. And then the crash, and then the silence. But now there was a new kind of silence, a silence filled with a silence that wasn't the absence of life, but a space for life to grow in its own time. He didn't need to fix it. He didn't need to make it perfect. He just needed to be Noah was in his usual spot by the window, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. But this time, Eric didn't feel the need to rush over to him. He didn't feel the need to demand a reaction, to push for a moment that would confirm that Noe was coming back. He simply stood there, watching as Noage's hand twitched, ever so slightly, his fingers flexing in the soft light of the evening. And then something changed again. It wasn't a grand gesture, a dramatic moment. It wasn't a word or a movement. But Eric saw it. For the first time, Noe's gaze shifted from the window and slowly moved to meet his father's eyes. It wasn't quick, it wasn't forced. But it was real. No, with all his silence, all his stillness was present. He was here. And somehow that was enough. Eric's chest tightened with emotion, but it wasn't pain, it wasn't grief. It was something else, something deeper. It was the recognition that Noe had always been here. Not in the way he had expected, not in the way he had wanted, but here nonetheless. He wasn't fixed, but he was alive, and for Eric that was enough. He didn't need more. He didn't need the answers or the solutions. He just needed to witness the life that was already unfolding before him, in its own quiet, gentle way. Rose entered the room then, humming softly as she moved toward the kitchen. She didn't acknowledge Eric directly, but he saw her glance toward him, and he felt the weight of her gaze. She knew, she had known all along what he was beginning to understand, that sometimes healing doesn't come with grand gestures. Sometimes it comes with the quiet moments, the small flickers, the steady presence of people who simply show up. She had shown up for Noe, for Eric. "I'm going to step out for a while," Eric said quietly to her. "I'll leave you to it." She nodded, her smile soft but knowing. "Take your time," she said, her voice gentle. There was no need for further words. She understood him in a way no one else had. Eric stepped out of the room, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the pressure to fill the silence with answers. He didn't feel the weight of expectation. He simply moved through the house, letting the rhythm of life carry him. When he returned, hours later, the penthouse was quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the possibility that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. And as he walked back to Noe's room, he knew one thing for sure. It was enough to be there. No more rushing, no more chasing, just presence. As the days passed, a new kind of normal began to settle over the penthouse. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was a kind of peace, one that Eric had never thought he would find again. The house had always been a place of order, of meticulous planning, a fortress of control. But now it had become something else, a place of stillness, of space for things to grow. The walls didn't feel as though they were closing in anymore. They had opened up just enough to let the light in. Rose continued her work, moving through the rooms with the same quiet grace. She didn't try to rush things. She didn't try to fix Noe. She just was. And in that, she had become the center of a quiet revolution. Not through force or skill, but through her mere presence. She was the constant in the room, the one who had never stopped showing up, even when no one else could see what needed to be done. Eric watched her more often now, not with suspicion or curiosity, but with quiet reverence. She had unlocked something in him that he hadn't even known. Was there a part of him that was willing to accept, to wait, to feel? It was not just Noe who had changed, it was him too. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected that he would learn from Rose in the way that he had. But he had. And in some ways she had taught him more about life, about connection, about love, than all the therapy, all the science, all the medicine in the world ever could. No, still largely silent, had begun to show subtle changes. His eyes would follow people more intently now. His fingers twitched more often, not with the rigidness of before, but with a small, soft awareness. He was living again, slowly, steadily, and Eric could see it. Every day he saw it. It wasn't a dramatic recovery. It wasn't the perfect solution he had spent so many years hoping for. But it was real. It was life in its most fragile, delicate form. One evening, as the last light of the day filtered through the windows, Eric found himself sitting in the living room, watching Noe. His son sat in his usual spot by the window, his gaze distant, yet somehow more focused. For the first time in years, Eric didn't feel the urgent need to fill the silence. He didn't feel the need to fix anything. He simply watched. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel the weight of guilt. He just felt present. It was Rose's humming that broke the stillness, a soft melody floating through the air. Eric hadn't even realized how much he had come to depend on that sound, that simple act of presence. It was always there, steady, gentle, and somehow it was enough. Rose wasn't trying to heal Noe. She wasn't trying to fix his brokenness. She was simply being with him. And in that being, everything had begun to shift. No, as if sensing the change in the air, turned slightly toward Rose. His fingers twitched again, and for a moment it felt like everything had slowed down, like time had stopped just to give them this moment. Eric held his breath, waiting for something. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it. Something was happening. And then, in the quiet, Noe did something that shook Eric to his core. The smallest movement of his hand, so subtle, so delicate, that no one else would have noticed, but it was enough. He reached for the ribbon Rose had left lying across the arm of his wheelchair, his fingers curling around it, holding it in his grasp. Eric didn't move, he didn't speak, he simply watched, his heart hammering in his chest. The quiet victory was small, but it was everything Noe had chosen. He had responded, he had moved. It wasn't walking, it wasn't speaking. But it was something, it was life. Rose smiled softly as she saw the change in Noe, but she didn't make a big deal of it. She didn't rush to celebrate, she didn't make any grand announcements. She simply continued her work, humming softly, moving with the rhythm of the moment. She had never been about spectacle. She had always been about presence, and Eric, for the first time in years, felt the walls inside him begin to crumble. He had spent so much time trying to control, to fix, to make it all right. But in this moment, in this room, he understood something that had eluded him for so long. Healing didn't come from control, it didn't come from science or answers or solutions. It came from being, from showing up quietly, steadily, and allowing what was broken to slowly, gently heal. Rose continued her work in silence, and Eric didn't feel the need to speak. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, in the stillness, in the movement, in the presence of people who had shown up for each other, without expectation, without a need to fix. They had simply been. The days blurred together after that. Eric no longer felt the same urgency to fix, to control, to move forward. He allowed himself the space to simply be with Noe, with Rose. The house had become a home again, not because anything had been fixed, but because something had been felt. And that was enough. And then one day, as they all gathered together in the living room, something shifted again. Noe looked up, his eyes locking onto his father's, and for the first time he spoke. It wasn't a sentence, it wasn't a word Eric had expected, but it didn't matter. Because in that moment he was there, he was present, and that was enough, Dad. The word was rough, cracked, like something old and unused. But it was a word. And it was the only word that mattered. Eric's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat, and he could barely respond. But there was no need. The world had already shifted, his son had spoken, and in doing so, he had given him everything he needed. Not in perfection, not in a miracle, but in the simplest, most profound way possible. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.